Welcome to Behind the News. Right here, Behind the News, the next step, right here on WHCGHCR. Sorry about that. Was thinking about my old radio station at GHCR.New York. 99.5 on your dial, broadcasting from Harlem. I'm your host and producer, Nellie Hester Bailey, here in the studio with our engineer, Doug Frazier. We like to say at the from the beginning that the views expressed in this broadcast are those of management and are not those of management, but rather the guest and host and producer of this podcast. And again, my name is Nellie Hester Bailey, and our lead-in music was Miles Davis. And before that, I know you folks heard some really great gospel in James Cleveland, infamous Peace Be Still. And again, further announcement, at the top of the hour at 11 o'clock, we will have a public service announcement. It will be about 2 minutes, and that will come at the top of the hour. So stay tuned. Remain listening. We have a great program for you today. And let's start. Let's start with our guest right here again on GHCR Radio, New York City, right here broadcasting from the village of Harlem. We have as our special guest, Ralph Pointer. Mr. Pointer wears a number of hats. He has I'll just start with his more recent accomplishments. He has a program, What's Happening, on WBAI radio, and that radio program airs on Wednesdays at 8 to 9 p.m. And that's WBAI radio, 99.5 FM on your dial. So we want to announce that at the very beginning. Ralph Pointer, welcome to the program.
Well, good morning, Sister Nellie Bailey, and good morning to sisters and brothers at Grant House. And I'm reminded of the struggles we had at Grant House, and my timing is a little off. It could have been 10, maybe 15 years ago, when the same struggle that we're having today, we went to the root of this problem yesterday. And the root of the problem, and if I may say so, is the leadership in the Democratic Party. The leadership.
Absolutely, but Ralph, we have a lot of issues to cover in this hour. So let me start by asking you, because I have never interviewed a person who knew Malcolm X personally, and we have just concluded Black History Month. Could you talk about your relationship with Malcolm? You were his bodyguard, and I would imagine that you were in Harlem in 1963 when Malcolm organized and spoke at his Unity rally. So let's start there in terms of Malcolm X, the man that you knew, the activist that you knew.
Well, I would say the most misunderstood part of Malcolm X was that he was the most personable person you ever met. He was friendly, always had a smile on his face, but due to the media, they projected him as the devil incarnate, and it was so effective that even people of color were afraid of him. And I remember when he moved to Queens on, I believe, 97th Street, people were running around saying, Malcolm's coming, Black folk, that is. And I said, my friends and neighbors understand who the man really is. And I took them to the local grocery store, to the local barber shop, to the local snack shop to say, yeah, this is the Malcolm that we know. This is the Malcolm we must support. And everything he says is true. But understand whose side he's on. He's not the violent one. He's responding to a violent nation with a violent history. And
exactly.
So
how did you come to, Ralph, how did you come to meet him and to develop a political relationship with him, in that I would imagine you were part of his inner circle?
No, Malcolm's inner circle was of Muslims. Mm-hmm. Myself being a non-theist didn't fit. And this became the problem. And I remember having a meeting when I said, some of your personal people in your inner circle are agents. And a white revolutionary group had filmed these gentlemen in uniform in California, and we showed the film. And Malcolm refused to come to the meeting with the film, where the film was shown that these guys were police. And this created an emotional and a personal breach in our friendship. Now, the time that I spoke with Malcolm just quietly was in the office of Shirley Rector. Now, Shirley Rector was the secretary of the first Black borough president, Percy Sutton. And she had an office on 137th Street. And in those hectic days, Malcolm went around with a briefcase and flyers, and I had a briefcase and flyers. And there was a circle of people supporting Malcolm on the funds of the poverty programs. And it was important that no one knew about this. And I say that to say how we had time together. Now, Shirley Rector's office, there were 4 keys. She had a key for the super, her key, a key for Malcolm, and a key for me. And she says, on those cold winter days when you have no place to go, no one's going to be here before 5 a.m. But by 5 a.m., you got to be out, and don't leave any evidence that you have been there. And so in those evenings, we, it never a plan, just if I happened to be there and he was there, we would discuss issues. Now, this took place with several of the poverty organizations, the organization that did printing, and I never spoke of these things because the people may be, I think all of the people involved have passed on. And this was not a secret society, but it was secret. I didn't believe that we had a tight organization, so I didn't care to be associated with an organization where 5 minutes after we had a conversation, the government knew about the conversation. And so there were several organizations where Malcolm got his literature printed, where I got my literature printed, but the rules were the same. We had keys. We could not leave any literature laying around on the floor with the printing equipment. And it wasn't printing, it was a fancy Xerox machines that we used. And it was old-fashioned now. People may not even know about that type of print, but it was quick print. You could get flyers made and you could be on the street 5 minutes after they were done. And as I say, everything Malcolm said was the truth. And the other problem we had was the interpretation of Muslims in the Islam religion itself. And I know I had made a statement that upset many people when I had said, and I say it today, the Muslims in North Africa were as much responsible for slavery as the Christians in Europe. This is beginning slavery and the capturing of slaves. So the religion didn't work too well when it came to us because they were the slave catchers in North Africa that sent us here. And
Ralph, let's
Yes.
just go back a minute. You mentioned earlier that Blacks were afraid of Malcolm.
Yes,
Why
I did.
was that the case? Was
Because
it
of
the
this mass-
propaganda from the U.S. ruling class, a combination of issues or factors?
They had organized people of color, ministers, etc., to badmouth, that's the only way I can put it, the Nation of Islam. And Malcolm, speaking the truths that he did at the time that he did, Black folk were not accustomed to hearing those. And they always showed him with a scowl on his face. And I used to laugh at that, not realizing how serious that was, that people believed this nonsense. Just listen to his words, and he spoke them harshly, but that's hardly harsh in consideration that we were being lynched, put out of jobs, put out of housing, treated in the most cruel fashion, death by the terror of the police. And we're concerned about how someone presents an issue verbally. It's ridiculous. But then I recognize the power of the press.
Exactly. You also mentioned earlier COINTELPRO, and we recently learned upon the release of the two men convicted of murdering Malcolm that in fact they were innocent. So can you talk about that in relationship to COINTELPRO and what many believe was the involvement of the US government, including NYPD, the FBI, and the CIA in the assassination of Malcolm X?
As far as I'm concerned, and I have no inner information, they were all involved in looking to kill Malcolm. And one of the discussions we had was, I believe, in so many years ago, it was a late October day. And I was in around 5:30, 6 o'clock. I was in Shirley Rector's office. Shirley Rector was there, and Malcolm came in. And I says, gee, is it still raining? And his answer was, no, it stopped raining, but I'm sweating from running. And so I says, well, what are you running from? And he says, I believe there are two people behind me looking to kill me. And my response, and I can say this because the government knows what I carried at the time, so the people should know what I carried. I was armed. And I said to Malcolm, listen, these people, describe these people because they don't know me. And I'll go out and I'll walk down the street. And if I see them, I'm going to turn around and open up on them. When you hear, you come out, shooting. And he says, there's your problem. He says, you don't have all of the facts. I don't have the facts. I believe that there are two men of color following me. It's my belief is strong enough that I'm running, but I'm not ready to kill them just yet. And I said, therein is the problem. You're a gentle person. You're a nice person. If you have worked up a sweat running from people who you believe are looking to do you bodily harm, but that isn't evidence enough for you to fight back. And he says, that's the difference between you and I. And to pursue the conversation further than that would only lead to an argument. And so I says, well, I'm going to be here for a while and I will leave with you. And he says, no, I'm going to stay. And after a while, Shirley left, I left, and Malcolm didn't die that day. And
Do you
Mrs.
remember
Levy,
do you remember the day he was
could never
assassinated?
remember the day.
Were
I'm
you
just like,
there? I remember hearing you say that for some reason or another, something had happened and you were not there. So what happened? And
yes.
how did you learn of his assassination? I
I
would assume
remember
like
very
everybody
clearly.
else from the news media.
I was supposed to be there.
Mhm.
And it was after one of our discussions. And I had said I would, you with me?
Yes.
I had said, that's it. I'm not going to be there anymore, because before you went into a meeting, he had his bodyguards search everybody. And I had said, listen, when you guys come up to search me, just tell them to go through the routine, but don't search me because I'm carrying. And I don't want a discussion with them when right across the street, there are 2 New York City policemen. I says, that could be a perfect excuse to be busted with weapons. And so he says, well, these are my personal bodyguards. They have to talk to you. And I says, no, they don't. They can pretend to search me. And we have to have that understanding. And he says, I can't tell them that. And Mrs. Levy was there. And I said, well, if you can't tell them that, I'm not going to be there. And Mrs. Levy said, you must be there because I know about you. And in those days, my relationship with Lynn Stewart, a white woman, was frowned upon. She was a teacher. She was not a lawyer at the time. And she says, if you don't promise me you're going to be there, I'm going to be in the hallway of Lynn Stewart. Lynn Stewart lived in a project and in the Lower East Side, and shouting out to her neighbors her relationship with you. And it was actually almost funny, but I says, okay, Mrs. Levy, I take it back. I'm going to be there. That Sunday morning, I was in Queens and I was procrastinating with tea, and time went by. And I says, am I going to go risk being searched and exposed by these so-called friends of Malcolm? And while contemplating this, the phone rang and it was Mrs. Levy. And she says, Ralph, it's not your fault. I don't want you to think of it that way. And I says, what isn't my fault? And she says, Malcolm is dead. It was quite a blow. And I thank Miss Levy. It is not my fault. We had a discussion, a disagreement. And I hope you understand that having people that I was not secure with search me before going into the event, and that he hadn't told them, when Ralph comes, just make pretend. And when he said he couldn't do that, I just says, hey, this is a terrible risk. He's got to do that.
Yeah, I understand from different sources that the day that Malcolm was assassinated, he told his bodyguards not to search people coming into the hall, the Audubon ballroom.
I don't know anything about that, but that certainly makes me feel worse if that's true. That he told it, if that is true. I never heard anything like that.
I have heard that on a number of occasions. But Ralph, this is a good point to segue into Lynn Stewart. Lynn Stewart was a radical civil rights attorney. Some of our listeners may remember the case of Larry Davis and the fact that he was represented by Lynn. She represented the Sheikh Omar, the blind sheikh whom she represented, and the government came up with trumped up charges against her. She was sentenced to 10 years and only released after a compassionate plea from a number of people from around the world and the US. So can we talk about who Lynn Stewart was and your relationship to the cause and to her?
Yes, many years ago, during this time when all this happened, Lynn Stewart was a teacher, but she became notorious for her ability to relate to people of color. There was, you remember in the 60s, Harlem was 99 and 9/10% Black. And with political awareness, there was no acceptance of white folk in organizations. But Lynn Stewart's loyalty and in the struggle for community control set her apart. Years later, she became an attorney, but she became an attorney with political background, with a political history. And we were extremely close. And when she became a lawyer, she took on the cases of people of color, of political prisoners, of political activists, Black Liberation Army, Black Panther, Weather Underground, white organizations. She was very involved legally as well as politically. And when the case of Larry Davis came up, we were returning from New Jersey on the case of Richard Williams and Tommy Manning, who were accused of shooting New Jersey's most decorated trooper LaMonica. And when we pulled into Gay Street in the West Village, Bill Kunstler said, "Drive around the block." And I drove around the block and I says, "What's that about?" And he says, "There's a woman who is in my office. I saw her, and it is a woman, Larry Davis was in the news, having shot his way out."
You're tuned in to GAPR.NYC, Grant Houses Community Radio, home of the Community News Service and the soul of the Upper West Side.
Put a frog in boiling water and it'll jump right out. But put a frog in a pot of cool water and slowly heat it up, that frog will boil. As a metaphor for us and all that we go through as veterans, it's a story that rings true. We learn to endure the heat in silence. We apply what we learn to life, the bills, the job, the family, things we're expected to handle with ease. When life heats up around us, we just try to stay afloat. We let the water boil. Reaching out isn't easy, but you've never been interested in easy. You join because you are not afraid of hard work. You are not a frog. If you or a veteran you know needs support, don't wait until the water boils. Reach out. Find resources at va.gov/reach. That's va.gov/reach. Brought to you by the United States Department of Veterans Affairs and the Ad Council.
Ralph?
Yes, I'm here.
That was a public service announcement from our parent organization, WHCR, and it comes with each program at the top of the hour. So let's continue with your narrative, please.
Yes, when the case of Larry
Davis,
it was when Bill said drive around the block, he says, that's the man who was in the news. That's his mother. And I don't want that kind of a case. And Lynn Stewart said, that's my kind of case. And she says, Ralph, get to Rikers Island. We're going to do this case. And Bill said, well, Lynn, if you're going to do it, I'd like to do it with you. Now, there's a long story of, how it first happened. Stanley Cohen was legal aid for the Bronx. He knew Larry. He couldn't do the case. He suggested Bill, and I just told you how it went from Bill to Lynn.
Right.
And
now, Ralph, let's pause for a second. Some of our audience members may not remember the Larry Davis case. So give us a brief background on who he was and what he was charged with.
Well, the Larry Davis case was presented in the newspaper as the dude that elude. And why he was eluding the police was because they had threatened to kill him. Now, they threatened to kill him because they accused him of selling their drugs and not giving them the proceeds. And it's almost a funny story. When Larry says, well, the guys I'm giving it to haven't paid me, the police knew the guys he was giving it to. And when they approached them, they said, what are you, crazy? I paid Larry the money. Then Larry had to leave town. But he got ripped off in Newport News, Virginia, by a woman he thought was on his side. The money was gone. He had to come back to New York. When he came back to New York, the police were looking for him, and one of the policemen had gone to his mother and made the sign to his head and says, when we find Larry, this is what's going to happen. Well, Larry was moving around, and at the time, he was in his sister's apartment, which was next to his apartment. In one of these project buildings that if you went out the bedroom window, if you went out in one apartment, you were in one yard. And if you went out the window in another apartment, you were in another backyard. And when they attacked Larry, he had just watched all three of Rambo's movies, Rambo 1 and 2. And when we were discussing it, and when they broke into his apartment, they broke in shooting. His sisters ran out, but he was sitting on the couch, and he ran into the back room with his nephew and pushed his nephew down, and he was under a bed. This is key to the case. And when the police came in, they riddled that building, those rooms with bullets. And I had gone through everything, and I even found the policewoman's tooth that he had hit when he shot back, found all of the bullets. And the bullets were, the projectiles were in the bathtub that was beside the bedroom that he was in. And what got them was Larry explained to me, he says, a slug, a shotgun, 12-gauge shotgun slug creased his head. And when it creased his head, it knocked him out. And he said he saw blue and he was laying on the floor and he couldn't move. This is while the police were coming in shooting. And then when his senses came back and he started to shoot back, they couldn't imagine anyone could have existed with all of that firepower they have. And that's why they ran. That's why some of them, they left their guns on the floor because some of them were hit, and they ran out and they ran to the front door. Now, if you don't have a diagram, you can't see what I'm talking about. But they were shooting at the door, and Larry stuck his head out the door, and he fired a couple shots at the front entrance. And as they were shooting back, they broke the lock of his sister's apartment, because what they had done is they came in the entrance, they were in the hallway, and they were in the yard behind his apartment. I see another public service announcement. Hello?
No, it shouldn't be. The public service
Okay,
announcement
let me
comes
finish.
at the beginning, at the
Okay.
top of the hour.
Okay.
I don't think we reached
Let me
another
finish.
hour, but we have a
Let me
number of
finish.
other things to cover, because I wanted to ask you, number one, getting back to the Lynn Stewart case, she was eventually released on compassionate release with stage 4 cancer. And you know, I mean, it's a horrible thing to admit or even to say, but they released her as she was dying, which is what they have done to a number of political prisoners. And I know your deep passion for political prisoners. You have a podcast that you do that is dedicated to freeing all political prisoners. You mention it on a regular basis on your WBAI podcast. So let's pause here for a moment and talk about political prisoners and how you see that. Hello?
Political prisoners are people who saw the problems, people black and white, who understood the depth of the problems and did something to change it. And some call themselves, and I see them as prisoners of war, because there's always been a war against us. And the war on drugs was not on drugs, as we all know now, but at the time we didn't know. It was a war on us. And they used that to put us behind the bars. And so we fought this and we understood this. And one of the things that I used to point out how ridiculous this was that we know the opioid problem. How many white folks went to jail on opioids? They have no concern about drugs. Drugs was merely something used to put us in jail en masse. Now, when Lynn Stewart, who was an attorney who represented the blind sheikh, was charged with secretly talking to people in the Middle East, she made a press release through Reuters. And as you know, Reuters is the largest media, one of the largest international news services. It was hardly a secret. And they made that stick because just like they made Malcolm into a pariah, they made Lynn Stewart into the pariah. And the first political prisoners were, we all know who the first political prisoners were. And so it's an interesting thing. Those people who fought back became political prisoners without the respect and the laws governing political prisoners. For example, Hinckley, who shot at the president, hit several people, is out. Our guys who fought for liberation, some 50, 49 years, Jaleel Montekim just got out, 49 years. Skip Fitzgerald died chained to his bed as sick. But we have so many political prisoners that the people are not supporting. We're supporting the nonsense of the Democratic Party and not supporting our political prisoners. We don't even demand that our freedom of our political prisoners for a vote. We just vote for them. We don't have a demand to free those who gave their lives for us, the rest of us here, our children and our community are still inside because this government is at war with us and at war with anybody who sides with us, and most particularly with those who do something about it. Now, let me correct you there. Lynn Stewart was sentenced to 28 months for violating a prison regulation And the regulation stated that if you violate this prison regulation, you may not be able to visit your client. Lynn made a press release for as you know, she said the prosecutors are making press releases constantly, and those defense attorneys cannot make a press release. And she says it's unfair. She made a press release. And
Right.
and the judge sentenced her to 28 months. And then the friends of Bush, cousins of Bush, on the appellate division said that's not enough time because she doesn't take it back. She doesn't say, I'm sorry. And she said, as many of my clients have told me, I can do 28 months standing on my head.
Right.
Well,
let
the
me
judge
ask you.
used that and said, well, because she's not sorry about what she did, and she didn't do anything wrong.
Well, let
we're
me
going
ask you
to-
another question because the time is moving on and we have a number
Okay.
of things to cover. I don't think I misquoted
changed it.
anything, but be that as it may, let's talk about the Democratic Party and the Black Miss Leadership class as so coined by my late friend and co-host Glenn Ford. Let's talk about the Democratic Party and the Black Miss Leadership class today because they have not changed at all. The treachery and betrayal is still there.
Well, we go back to the basic information as to what the struggle is. The struggle is for power. The Democratic Party, we joined the Democratic Party, but we joined as individuals, and it's set up as such that we don't carry power with it. We are just individuals in the Democratic Party without a group philosophy or a group position. And we must remember this drug act, this crack cocaine act was supported by when I say our, cowardly caucus members in Congress who voted for the crack drug act. Black Congressional Congress voted for the crack cocaine act, was the basis for putting many of our people on the inside. And I only know of Cynthia McKinney, and right here in New York, Charles Barron were the only people who supported political prisoners, who spoke out and said, these people should be free. And so what are the rest of these people doing? What are the rest of these Black people doing? They're certainly not representing the Black community. They're representing the Democratic Party. Look at the Vietnam War. They represented the Democratic Party. Muhammad Ali said, no Vietnamese called me nigger. How many of the congressmen backed him up? And here today, we have the celebration of the NFL. More people watched it than ever, but no word of Colin Kaepernick, who resisted in the most peaceful, compliant way you could. He took a knee. Where are our representatives? And the fact of the matter is they are not our representatives. They represent something else. And here we have the situation of the war in Eastern Europe.
Yes,
Where
I was
are
coming
our
to
Black
Ukraine.
Bloc
That was next, my next question.
one.
Your thoughts and opinions about that. And do the people of Donbass who have lived under terror since 2014, the coup d'etat that the U.S. led against the democratic elected government of Ukraine, and that was to the tune of $5 billion spent by the U.S. So please go ahead. What are your thoughts about Ukraine? Why is Ukraine supposedly of some sort of interest, strategic interest to the U.S.? And what about the U.S. proxy NATO that has wreaked havoc throughout the Middle East and beyond.
Well, it's obviously when you said send the money to Ukraine, I almost laughed. And I says, is that the same as they sent the pallets of bills to Iraq? Is that the same as holding the money of the people, the government of Afghanistan? Is that the same as the China lobby? And the answer is yes. I don't know how much money got to where they said it's going. I know it's a corrupt American government that uses American taxpayer money, and they say they're doing A and they're doing B. And so it is very interesting, this whole question of why Russia, Putin, they use the term, attacked Ukraine. And it's the same reason that the United States attacked Russia when they said they were having ballistic missiles 90 miles away. They were ready to go to war over that. But they say Putin is wrong if he says he's going to war if you put ballistic missiles next door. And having the Ukraine join North Atlantic Treaty Organization is like having ballistic missiles next on your border. And so, it's such a hypocrisy on every level. Of course, if it's going to be a state, a neutral state, they should not be allowed to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That is the armed forces of the United Nations, of the European Union, and they have, as you say, been wreaking havoc all over the world. What does that say? The question, 900 American bases around the world, military bases. They're not schools or educational institutions. They are there to rule by power. And I say they forced Russia. First, they hyped the American media to say, oh, bad Russia, they got all of these troops. And they kept saying, and this was the final answer, and I quote, Ukraine is not joining NATO for now. And I says, there it is. That's Biden, not for now, but Putin was forced to go into Ukraine or have intercontinental ballistic missiles next door. And the United States fought for having ballistic missiles 90 miles away. And I say, what if the Russians had ballistic missiles on the Mexican border? What would the United States do? And this is what they wanted to do to Russia and say they forced this war on Russia. And Russia responded properly. I do not believe in nonviolent defense, not for anybody. Self-defense, self-determination for people and countries. And
with
we know
regards
what
to
America is capable of, and to allow them to put ballistic missiles next door is the most outrageous thing I ever heard of.
Absolutely.
But they sold that to the American people the same as they sold Malcolm as the devil, the same as they sell who the enemy is and who your friends are. And Malcolm told us about that.
With regard to the Cuban Missile Crisis, that Allen Dulles convinced President Kennedy, to put ballistic missiles in Turkey. This was an article in Atlantic magazine. Senior Gore, Al Gore's father, came holy hell with Kennedy, calling him out for doing this, and replied with, well, what would you do if the Soviet Union put ballistic missiles in Cuba, which is exactly what they did. And the deal was Khrushchev would remove the missiles from Cuba, and the US, Kennedy, would remove the missiles from Turkey. And that is how that went down. But let's talk about US imperialism and its decline, because they are no longer the global superpower that they have imposed on the rest of the world. This is, in fact, a multipolar geopolitical reality, not a unipolar reality. And the US, as some are concerned with great consternation, are questioning whether or not the US would risk a nuclear war to restore its hegemonic role as the dominant force of the globe. What are your thoughts about that? Are they that gone?
I don't try to get inside the head of what this government would do. They have done most horrific things. I would not put it past them. So I make no decisions on what they would do. I know what they have done. And based on what they have done, I know that the war of the worlds is not a Hollywood movie. The war of the worlds is the history of the United States trying to control the world. And they may have made a mistake. And as we understand that North Korea has supersonic speed ballistic missiles, and everybody thought it was China who had the supersonic speed ballistic missiles, but it was North Korea. And so I think the day and age of Western dominance of the world is over, because as you know, some 20, 25 years ago, although China is America is their number one trading partner, they are looking westward, Indonesia, the rest of the world, to do business. And so we're looking, and as people say, well, if they have an embargo on Russia, will it hurt America as much as it hurts Russia? Good question. China has prepared. They've sided with Russia. They have prepared to ditch America as a trading partner. And I think the first thing that the corporate media had to announce was that the large trade agreements between China and Russia, China is prepared. And the question that we're looking at gas prices and people who heat their homes with fuel oil, are we prepared for this type of action?
Exactly. And in this country, 30 to 40 million tenants are at and homeowners are at risk of eviction. And then you have the COVID pandemic, you have the lockdown, and the resentment against that, not that policy, the lockdown policy, not only here, but across the world. You have Biden at the lowest poll level than any president. I believe it was lower than Trump. And the Democrats are clearly worried about the midterm elections, and I believe they're going to get wiped out. Hence this bellicosity toward Russia. And you see, we're big and strong, and look what we're doing, and we're taking on this giant. But the US imperialism never takes into account unintended consequences. They never do. And they are forever digging a hole for themselves. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, it's the obvious that there is confusion on the part of the American public. And this is reflected in their resistance to any real history. They don't want to know history. And I understand that, because the American history is so horrific, even it gives me goose pimples on the things that America has done internally as well as externally. And I would go down a whole list of hours to talk about the atrocities the Americans have committed in their imperialist struggle to control the resources of the rest of the world. And we must understand that we are a part of the resources of Africa. They brought us here as a resource, and they've been using us as a resource ever since. In housing, we are merely on a reservation. They put us in one spot, and then when they want the spot, they take it back, just like they did with the indigenous people called Indians in America. They put them on a reservation. If there's any value, like the Black Hills, the first big treaty, oh, wow, we found gold there, we have to change that. And it goes on and on and on. There's no treaty that they sign that you can count on them keeping the treaty. And so we are in a position where Americans don't trust their government. For COVID, well, I don't know where COVID came from. I believe that COVID was biological warfare going astray. I don't know that, but I don't trust the government. And if you don't have a government that you can trust, then you don't have a government that can rule. And this COVID thing really showed that people do not trust this government. They don't trust the solutions and the answers they give. And so they rebel naturally. While this is just one thing. What about Ukraine? This is another thing. People rebelled against the government decisions on Vietnam, but it's reaching a high pitch each year, each generation, each moment in history. As history moves forward, people have less trust, and that means that this government cannot govern.
My last question, Ralph, is what are your thoughts about the left, the white left, the black left, if they do exist? And what do you pretend is the future for the Black liberation struggle?
It's going to build out of necessity because, as you know, as we all know now, we never got a national health care program. There is no money for Build Back. And right away, Biden is on, I'm sending billions to Ukraine. Wait a minute, you just dropped Build Back better. I'm sending billions to freedom in Ukraine. Wait a minute, we haven't fought about people of color having the right to vote. I'm sending billions. Wait a minute. But
what about reparations?
It's not waiting a minute. They're going right ahead with this nonsense. So I predict dire things. People will be forced to fight back the same way Russia is forced to fight back. And
exactly.
Maybe that's the only way we're going to get a fight back. But I say we got to begin now by freeing our political prisoners, those who fought back. And we have no concern whatsoever. We talk about being Christians. Wait a minute. We talk about Jesus giving his life. Wait a minute. What about our guys who gave their lives for just a little bit of freedom, for the right to vote, the right to ride on a bus in the front, the right to go to school, and we don't control our schools? Wait a minute. And the Democratic Party and those who supported just willy-nilly or totally with, it's hard, it's beyond my ability to express how bad it is. The Colin Powell syndrome. I believe what these people say. That is the Colin Powell syndrome. Our whole nation of people of color are involved with the Colin Powell syndrome. Whatever they say, I believe it, and I'll act on it. And we must start having truths and beliefs that the facts tell us. And if this opioid problem didn't tell us clearly what the government is about concerning Black people, clearly what our colored caucus of congressmen are about, as you call them, the misleadership class, I don't know what else will. And so we have to continue speaking truth to power. I think that, and we know there's a price of speaking truth to power. And one day, we will learn, because when it's right down to affecting our personal way of life, and this housing thing, nothing is more basic than having a home. And they're going to take that away. And
yes, the privatization of public housing is underway here in New York City, and there are groups who have gotten together. Let me pause for a second and check with our engineer, my engineer, Doug. How much time is left?
We're running up against the end.
Oh, okay. Well, Ralph Pointer, thank you very much for being our guest today. I do hope that you will come back. We're working up to getting folks to call in, but we'll see about that. But we enjoyed so much and learned so much from you today. And thank you, Ralph Pointer. And we
Well,
want
thanks.
our listeners to know you have been listening to Behind the News, The Next Step. I'm your host and producer, Nellie Hester Bailey, with our engineer, Doug Frazier, here on GHCR Radio .nyc. We'll see you the next time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Kim, are you still here?